Hey guys, and welcome back for another episode in my history series, where today I want to share with you a story that I've been wanting to talk about for a really long time, but I find this one really rough. There are some stories I research that give me really visceral reactions, stories that I then see in my dreams I can't stop thinking about, and this is one of them. When I first read this story years ago, it took me a really long time to come to terms with it, and that doesn't make it more tragic than anything else I talk about on my channel, but being a member of the LGBTQ+ community, crimes and history involving the community just hit me that little bit harder. And that's right, you didn't think I was going to go all the way through Pride Month without sharing at least one LGBTQ+ story. This is a story of an arson attack at a gay bar in New Orleans in 1973, which led to the tragic deaths of 32 people. It was the largest mass death of LGBTQ+ individuals in the United States up until the Pulse shootings in 2016. But one thing hugely differed here from Pulse. Back in 1973, nobody cared. Nobody cared that 32 mostly LGBTQ+ people died. They weren't acknowledged. And if they were acknowledged, it was only to be laughed at. Survivors couldn't admit to being there at the UpStairs lounge bar that night. They couldn't talk about their trauma for risk of being ostracised, of losing their jobs, losing their families. Everything about this story is tragic beginning to end. And this is officially an unsolved crime and the most deadly fire on record in New Orleans history. Although just how forgotten and dismissed this fire can be is illustrated in this one point. A 1991 exhibit at the Louisiana State Museum about historic fires in New Orleans managed to omit this one entirely. It just wouldn't be talked about. Before we get into the real bulk of this video, we do need to start with some context around homosexuality in the USA at this time in the 1970s. I feel like when most people think of the mistreatment of queer people, the first thing that pops into your head is the AIDS crisis, the indifference to hundreds of thousands of gay men dying, the lack of action by not just the USA government, but governments all across the Western world. Of course, mistreatment of queer people in the USA specifically has long predated the AIDS crisis, and I'm focusing on the USA because that's where this fire, the UpStairs lounge fire, took place. Although homosexuality had always been, let's say, frowned upon, the real hatred began in the aftermath of World War II in a moral panic that was named the Lavender Scare. I do have a whole video about the Lavender Scare and I could go on forever because once you get me started on queer history, you're not going to stop me. But essentially, this paralleled the anti-communist thoughts at the time. It paralleled the Red Scare. In a nutshell, it was thought that gay men and lesbians were more likely to be communist sympathisers, as they were more susceptible to being manipulated. You had loose morals if you were gay, which in turn meant they were considered to be national security risks. Therefore, openly gay people, or even not openly gay people, were ousted from their jobs in government. And this is something the USA, and by extension the rest of the world, still feels the effects of to this day. A lack of representation of any minority in high government reverberates throughout the rest of the country. If you've got nobody fighting for your rights at the top, that trickles down and it results in the kind of mistreatment we saw, sadly still see, of the LGBTQ+ community. It was in 1952 that the American Psychiatric Association's Diagnostic Manual listed homosexuality as a mental disorder, but not just that, as a sociopathic personality disturbance. The next year, the executive order came in banning homosexuals from working in federal government. LGBTQ+ people were forced to hide away, but not everyone did. At great personal risk, some queer people started to fight. We often think of the Stonewall riots in New York City in 1969 as the beginning of the gay rights movement, and whilst it does definitely have a huge place in our history, the truth is that people were fighting for years beforehand, riots and protests happening across the country. But the first gay pride marches were held in multiple cities across the USA on the first anniversary of Stonewall in June 1970. All of this to say that the gay rights movement was very much in full swing at the time of the 1973 UpStairs lounge disaster, but the response to it proved just how far there was to go. The response was callous and cruel, and it breaks my heart, and sadly it's something that a lot of history books just seem to skip past. Since the Pulse shootings in 2016, parallels between the two disasters have been drawn, and the fire is more discussed now, which is something. And I do also want to mention here that whilst there were these incredible trailblazers openly fighting for gay rights, throwing caution to the wind and accepting whatever consequences came of their fight, there were also the gay people who just wanted to get through life. One is not more right than the other. A lot of people just wanted to get through life without being hate crimed. They wanted to remain in the closet, hidden behind the scenes. Not everyone is a revolutionary, and that's okay, especially when considering the consequences you could face of being homosexual back in 1973. All of which brings us to New Orleans, Louisiana in 1973. A city of huge culture today, known for its festivals and parties. It's always been a place of great life. It's also always been more of a liberal haven in amongst the strict conservatism of most of the traditional South, and Southern gays would tend to flock there, the same way that people would flock to New York or San Francisco. It was a queer capital, but it was a queer capital in the South, in amidst a city that had a very heavily Catholic population. So there was more of a queer life that could be had in New Orleans, with a queer population of around 75,000 people, and it had more gay bars and more opportunities, but that didn't really mean that you could live out in the open. It's all relative. It's thought that less than 1,000 of those 75,000 people would be considered out by today's standards. Which is where the UpStairs lounge bar comes into the picture. It was a sanctuary for the gay community. It was so named because it was a second-story bar at 3-story 604 Iberville Street, and it opened on Halloween night 1970. The bar was pretty much concealed from the streets down below. You wouldn't necessarily know it was there unless you knew it was there, which was always what gay bars aimed for. They very much depended on the discretion of the people who attended, so that straight homophobic people walking past the entrance wouldn't know what was happening inside. If it was common knowledge where a gay bar was, that could open you up to possible attacks, hatred, stuff that you didn't really want in a safe space. The way you'd hear about gay bars was through word of mouth, but UpStairs was special in that it wasn't just for gay men. A main source I used for this video is this book. It's called TinderBox, The Untold Story of the UpStairs Lounge Fire and the Rise of Gay Liberation by Robert W. Fieseler. This is an incredible book. It's a really in-depth look at the story around the fire, but also at the people, at the victims. It really humanises the people involved. I highly recommend it if you're looking for a good non-fiction book, but I just want to pull a quote directly from the book here from Buddy Rasmussen, who was the bartender and the day-to-day manager of the bar. Buddy told a Times-Picayune journalist, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, back in the 1990s, "It was off the beaten path. But the UpStairs had a regular, steady clientele, mostly employed people, mostly gay, but some straight, some women too. It was just a wide variety of people. We had politicians who come in here, we had doctors, lawyers, everyday, hourly wage, blue-collar people." If you were accepting, UpStairs was accepting. Buddy and the other workers and the regulars at the UpStairs would be wary of any newcomers though, of course. They'd analyse the situation, analyse the safety of themselves and of others, especially if said newcomers turned up alone or acting uncomfortable or suspicious. It wasn't really uncommon for people to go into gay spaces and find people to blackmail or sometimes just outright attack. You had to be really careful about who you let into these spaces. But once you'd proven that you weren't a threat, then you were accepted and you were loved, you were part of the family. But of course the UpStairs lounge did have a lot of rules, although I suppose no more than most other bars. Drugs weren't really allowed on the premises, although of course it happened. You'd get cut off if you got too drunk, although as long as you were still polite, Buddy the bartender would ensure you were looked after. You weren't allowed to have sex on the premises, although again it did happen. Gay bars and clubs still today have this reputation amongst some as being very promiscuous places, particularly the bathrooms. But as TinderBox, this book, quite rightly points out, it was illegal to partake in homosexual activity wherever you were. Even if you were in the comfort of your own home, it was still illegal. At least at a gay bar, if you were caught having sex, you know that the person who caught you isn't likely to report you to the authorities, and that couldn't be said for anywhere else, even in your own home. But generally, although it happened, UpStairs wasn't that kind of place. It was a community bar. The regular patrons were a family. It had a very well-worn piano down the end of the bar, which people would gather around on a nightly basis and sing show tunes. Yes, it's a stereotype. Sometimes stereotypes are incredibly true. This was not a seedy bar. It was a bar for good, regular, working class people. Not that it would make a difference if it was a seedy bar, people lost their lives, but I'm trying to paint a picture here. And UpStairs was quite a big bar as well, so to enter you had to go up a staircase that you'd access from ground level. You'd have to ring a doorbell and wait for somebody inside to answer before you could enter through the metal front door. This front door led directly into the bar room, with the bar up against the length of one wall with Iberville Street down below, and the piano was down the end of the bar. Leading off of the main bar was the lounge and a space for storage, and then off the lounge was the theatre, complete with a stage where drag shows and melodramas would be held. On the night in question, the door to the theatre was locked. But off the back of the stage in the theatre room was a door which led onto a roof, and other than the front door, that was the only other exit out of the bar. All of which sets the scene very nicely for me to tell you about the 24th of June 1973, 49 years ago to the day that I'm uploading this episode, which, would you believe, was not actually planned when I was scheduling my content for this month, but just seemed to be destiny. Around 2 p.m. on that Sunday, Buddy opened the bar and served his first customer. And Sundays were very popular afternoons at the UpStairs, as there was always an event on called the Beer Bust, in which you'd pay $1 for 2 hours of bottomless beer between 5 and 7 p.m. It was a fantastic deal and really brought the customers in. Then at 7 p.m. the beer bus would end and people would hang around for the rest of the night. There were around 90 people there on the night in question, and that was certainly less than the bar's 110-person fire code limit. And it really was a Sunday evening like any other. People socialising, some sitting around the piano singing, nothing was unusual. That was until the arrival of a man called Roger Dale Nunez in the evening. Roger Nunez was a face around the UpStairs that people vaguely knew, but not really for the right reasons. As loving and accepting as the clientele of the bar was, Nunez gave people weird vibes and he never really clicked with anyone there. And perhaps for good reason. Robert Fieseler writes in TinderBox that Nunez arrived drunk and he immediately headed for the bathroom, where he locked himself in a stall and started looking through a peephole in the wall into the adjoining stall. Very creepy kind of behaviour. According to others who were there, he even started whispering words of encouragement to people in the other stall until somebody eventually reported him to Buddy. Once Nunez left the toilet stall, he then picked a fight with the wrong person who ended up punching him to the ground, and at that point Buddy made the decision to throw him out. Nunez did put up a fight as he was dragged out the bar. It took multiple men to get him out, and multiple people also heard him shout something along the lines of, "I'm going to burn you all out," as he was removed. But people make threats when they're angry and intoxicated. Nobody had any reason to actually believe him. But then at 7:53 p.m, somebody emptied a can of lighter fluid on the stairs leading up to the bar and lit a flame. Things from here progressed incredibly quickly. People in the street down below were the first to notice what was going on, with a pedestrian running into another local bar to tell them to call the emergency fire number. 911 didn't yet exist in New Orleans at this time. But even by that point, it was clear that the fire was already out of control. It had taken over the stairway, floor to ceiling. There was no way anybody was going to be able to come down those stairs. Then a buzzer started going off in the bar, a buzzer from street level that taxi drivers or delivery drivers would often use. The buzzing was relentless, and Buddy the bartender thought it was somebody playing a prank or the buzzer had broken. So he shouts over to a regular called Luther Boggs to open the front door and see what was going on, and Luther obviously does just that. As he opens the metal front door, he allows a rush of air, oxygen, down into the stairwell. If you watched my video from last month on the King's Crossfire, you might be familiar with the phenomenon that happened next. A flashover, a fireball comes shooting through the door and into the bar. People in the fireball's direct path were immediately burned. Poor Luther Boggs was thrown to the floor by the pressure of it. Buddy jumped into action immediately, hopping over the bar and shouting for people not to panic. He knew another way out. But this was complicated by the fact that the smoke meant it was pitch black. You could barely see your own hands in front of your face. Some men started throwing chairs through a window above Iberville Street to try and get out onto the fire escape. But once on the fire escape, there was no ladder down to the street, only to the rooftop above. One man jumped 12 foot off the metal railing of the fire escape onto the street below, where people rushed to put the flames on his clothes out. One couple were trapped by the front door and, knowing that they were going to die if they didn't take a risk, decided to run down the flaming stairwell, and they did make it out onto the street. Meanwhile, Buddy was trying to unlock the door to the theatre room, through which he led the way to an exit onto the rooftop, saving around 40 people. All of this happened within 4 minutes of the fire being started. Once on the safety of the rooftop, 3 people decided to re-enter the bar to try and help lead others to safety. Once he thought that everyone had returned, Buddy headed back into the theatre hall and called out to people, calling to remaining survivors, saying there was another way out, and nobody replied. He made a decision in that moment and closed the metal door to the theatre room. Having learned in the Air Force that it was the best way to stop a fire spreading, he had to save the lives of the 40 people on the rooftop. What he sadly didn't realise was that one of the men who had re-entered was still inside the bar, trying to save his partner. That was Dwayne Mitch Mitchell, and he sadly died. Metal bars on most of the windows prevented people from being able to escape, although attempts were made by the skinnier ones to squeeze through. Ironically, these iron bars have been placed on the windows as a safety measure, as approved by city inspectors. Firefighters and pedestrians stood on the pavement down below to attempt to catch people who did squeeze through this 14-inch gap and jump. People fell to the ground, their clothes aflame, skin peeling off, but this was their only chance at survival, and a lot who jumped did survive. Some patrons managed to make it to the windows, but they didn't make it all the way out, their bodies burned and frozen, hanging halfway out. One of the most iconic, infamous, horrific, I don't really know what word to use to describe it, photos associated with the upstairs lounge fire is that of a burned body hanging halfway out of a window, a body that remained there long after the firefighters had put out the last of the flames. Despite all the carnage this fire caused, it actually burned for less than 20 minutes and was extinguished by 8:12 p.m. The man in the window's name was Bill Larson, and he was the reverend of the local Metropolitan Community Church, a pro-LGBT Protestant denomination church, the United States' first national gay Christian fellowship. Bill had used all of his strength to remove an air conditioning unit from the bottom of one of the large floor-to-ceiling windows, and he was attempting to get out to jump when a pane of glass fell on him from above, pinning him in place. He burned to death. No one in a position of authority bothered to remove Bill's body from view for at least 4 hours. The media descended upon the scene and snapped photos, of course. I'm not going to include the photo in this video. You don't want to see it. I wish I never did. A lot of the people who died upstairs that night were members of the MCC church. They often used the upstairs space for meetings. That day they'd met in the Lower Garden district of New Orleans and had made plans to meet at the bar later that afternoon. As I've said so many times in this video, upstairs was generally a safe space, and as you can imagine, members of MCC face a lot of discrimination. If you were a gay man or gay woman at the time who still wanted to practice your faith, MCC was basically one of your only options. It's tragic that these congregation members, feeling like they were in a rare place where they were safe in both their sexuality and religion, just had that torn away from them. They had their lives torn away from them. Once safely down on the street, Buddy started searching for the man that he knew to be responsible, the man who had threatened to burn down the bar as he was thrown out, Roger Nunez. And he quickly finds him, bringing him to the attention of police officers at the scene. However, the officers ignored him. As TinderBox writes, 2 gay men involved in the scuffle in front of them, they wanted nothing to do with it. They told Buddy to move along, so Buddy was forced to let Roger go. Other people tried to explain to the officers what had happened, but they were also dismissed, threatened with arrest if they didn't go away. This is what it was being gay in the USA in the 1970s, particularly in the more conservative states. You were either to be ignored completely, whether you were the victim of a crime or not, or threatened with arrest just for the crime of being homosexual. And of course, that was generally enough to stop any interactions with law enforcement at all. The discrimination and illegality around homosexuality meant that the police didn't trust witnesses and they weren't able to investigate impartially. Ultimately, they just didn't care enough to dedicate a proper investigation, and because of this, Roger Nunez was let go and ultimately no justice would ever come for the victims of this fire. 32 people died in total, about 1/3 of the people who were at the bar that evening. 28 people died at the scene of the fire, most of them in the bar room. 1 person died en route to the hospital, and 18 people suffered quite serious injuries, of which 3 ended up dying. Luther Boggs, the man who opened the front door, was one of these. Alongside Dwayne, Mitch Mitchell and Bill Larson, the other 29 victims were John Adams, Reginald Adams, Guy Anderson, Joe Bailey, Louis Broussard, Herbert Cooley, Donald Dunbar, Adam Fontenot, David Gary, Horace Skip Getchell, John Golding Sr., Gerald Gordon, Richard Dick Green, James Hambrick, Kenneth Harrington, Robert Bob Pumpkin, Leon Maples, George Bud Mathieu, Clarence McCloskey Jr., Larry Stratton, Eddie Hosea Warren, James Curtis Warren, and their mother Willie Inez Warren. Dr. Perry Lane Waters Jr., and for many years there were also 4 unidentified victims, known only as unidentified white males. 2 of these victims were tentatively identified at the time, but we'll touch on that in just a moment. 1/3 of these victims were under 30 years old, some had families, children, wives, some were straight, some were living under a heteronormative society, and so had started families to fit in. Some victims were in their late 40s and early 50s, and universal conscription would have meant that they would have fought in World War II. They survived a war and then died like this, with no dignity. The process of identification at the time of the fire was much trickier than something similar would be nowadays. Detectives with the New Orleans PD interview people in the aftermath, taking names of people seen in the bar and cross-referencing with names of people they knew to have survived. It was tricky though, as even survivors didn't want to come forward and admit that they had escaped, because doing so would mean outing themselves as attending a gay bar that night, which would have severe consequences on their lives. A major source of names of attendees at the bar that night came from the MCC, of which 1/3 of the congregation died. After a long process, investigators did get a list of names. Some of the victims had ID on them at the time, which made things easier. Some had family members come forward. They did get a list of victims eventually. But the remaining unidentified victims had all sustained extensive burns on up to 90% of their bodies, rendering them completely unrecognisable. The descriptions of their bodies in the autopsies are incredibly vague and therefore of little help. It also didn't help that a lot of queer people at this time would change their names, or at least be known under fake names, because it protected themselves and their families if their sexuality was discovered. Lots of people would change their surnames at the very least to ensure that they couldn't be traced back to their families. It was really serious to be accused of being homosexual in this time. The word homosexual was seen as akin to sexual predator. It was shameful. Rubbing salt in the wound of the community, the New Orleans Catholic Archbishop at the time, Philip M. Hannon, refused to respond to the disaster, staying completely silent, despite responses to all other tragedies of this scale that happened throughout his career. Do you call being an archbishop a career? I guess so. Believed to be at Hannon's orders, Catholic priests across the city refused to bury any Catholics killed in that fire and turned their families away. The media reported that the Catholic Church were refusing to bury the victims because many gay people carried false identification papers, which a lot of them did do, as I mentioned just a moment ago, but this wasn't the reason. They just refused to bury the gays. Sometimes family members refused to even claim the remains of their loved ones once they'd learned how they died. And the city refused to accept an offer from a local church who were willing to take charge of the burials of the identified and the aforementioned unidentified or unclaimed men, and instead the city just buried them in a potter's field called Rest Haven. In later Hurricane Katrina, burial records for Rest Haven were lost, and the city now has no idea which plot is who, despite the fact that 2 of the men there have since been formally identified. Ferris LeBlanc was a World War II veteran who had made it through the war physically unscathed. Perhaps the things he saw led him to believe that life was too short, and over the coming decades he accepted his sexuality. He was a gay man, something his family actually largely accepted about him. By 1973, he had just celebrated his 50th birthday and was settled in Louisiana, deciding to go out one night to the UpStairs lounge, where he would sadly perish in the fire. Now at the time, Ferris was actually identified through an anonymous caller who recognised him by a ring that he wore at the time, but at no point did this news ever get back to his family in California. Investigators never bothered to look through Ferris's military records to find a point of contact, and thus he was buried in an unmarked grave, no flag, no ceremony for a war veteran. To his family, Ferris just vanished, and they wouldn't find out what happened to him for over 4 decades when they heard through the grapevine that there was something about him on the internet. So his nephew did a Google search and up popped the UpStairs fire. His family had always wondered where he'd gone, and now they knew. They just had to find him and bring him home. Only that is a battle they are still fighting thanks to the lack of records. The field, Rest Haven, he was unceremoniously buried in by the city, has no markings, nothing to even suggest it's a cemetery. Hopefully one day his family will find him and bring him home and give him a proper burial, but the city has still no help with this. Another unidentified or unclaimed victim at the time was Larry Norman Frost, a name that many people included on their list of people who were at the bar at the time of the fire, and at the time he was listed as tentatively identified. However, his body was never positively identified or claimed. Larry Frost was from Detroit, Michigan, and he was always very close to his family and to the church. When he moved away from his family to New Orleans, one of the first things he did was join the MCC. His family described him as a free spirit, never in one place for long. He was very independent, but always remembered to send postcards back to his family. It was very unusual when those postcards suddenly stopped. According to an article by Robert L. Camina on advocate.com, Larry's family say they didn't know that he'd been a victim, maybe. Police reports from the time show that detectives did have Larry's mother's contact details, but they don't know if that's how the family found out. They don't know if the police contacted them. Of course, it's been many years, people have died, siblings are grown up, they just don't really know. Nancy, Larry's youngest sibling, says that she remembers finding out about Larry when she sent a letter to her brother, but it was returned to her with a note saying person deceased. Other family members say there was a phone call, others say they recall nothing, it wasn't really talked about, and they only actually went searching for Larry once he hadn't been heard of for quite a while. Regardless, his body was never claimed. Robert Camina speculates in his article that it was because of the shame of Larry being a gay man, and it seems like there was just a lot of secrecy within the family. It wasn't really spoken about. Larry's brother Donald eventually did drive to New Orleans to find him, and he spoke to Larry's landlord, who said that Larry left one night and never came back. Nothing was packed, so it was clear that he hadn't moved on. The landlord told Donald that he'd suspected Larry had died in the fire as he was known to frequent upstairs. So then Donald decided to speak to the company that did the burials, the company that buried his brother, as he might have had medical history that would have helped with the identification. In his 20s, Larry had been in a car crash that resulted in him needing metal plates implanted in his face. But this didn't help, the company had no records. Eventually, Donald had to give up and return home, but many family members have since accepted that Larry did die in the fire that night, and he is indeed one of the unidentified. He has since been added to an official list of victims, but news of the fire just never really reached the Frost family at this time, or maybe it reached one of them, maybe the mum, maybe the dad, maybe they never really shared. Nobody really knows what happened. In fact, news of the fire didn't reach most of America. Even in the New Orleans and wider Louisiana press, it was a blip headline of the papers, and then it was forgotten about entirely. In the immediate hours after the fire, journalists flocked to the scene, but then rumours started to spread that this was a gay bar, and they were stuck with a decision. Either report on the fire but omit the fact it was a gay bar because the word homosexual was too scandalous to even think about printing in the papers, or just omit it completely, ignore the fire. Some did print the news but minimised it, they minimised the death counts and the victims. Very few papers nationwide reported the bar for what it actually was, a gay bar, but then immediately the legitimacy of the fire and the sympathy for those involved was diminished. People didn't care about homosexual men dying in a fire. It was just called the gay bar fire, and soon the joke started. If the fact that it was a gay bar was mentioned, it would be quickly followed by a punchline. The homophobia was beyond what a lot of us could ever imagine today. One radio personality, when talking about the fire and the burials, suggested that the best way to dispose of dead fruits being a common slang word for gay men at the time, was to bury them in fruit jars. Other journalists used terms, punchlines like fruit flies, and made burning F-word and flaming queens jokes. The police chief only reinforced these views when he told reporters that identifying the body was going to be tough because some thieves hang out there, and this was a queer bar. Who cares? It was a queer bar. The overarching opinion outside of the gay community was that they deserved it. That's what you get for being gay. That's what you get for going against God's words. The fact that a huge amount of the victims were from a Christian congregation was just further proof that they had been going against God's will. It makes me sick to think about. People in the gay community at the time said they expected the wider New Orleans community to be up in arms about what had happened, but people barely blinked an eye. It was a blip, and then it was forgotten. People didn't care. In fact, some celebrated. But that's not surprising. A 1969 survey by Time, which was just 4 years beforehand, said that 63% of Americans considered homosexuality to be harmful to American life. And this being in the South, you can bet that majority was higher there. This response from the entire country was isolating. You couldn't talk about your grief, you couldn't talk about your best friend or your partner who had died, because you would face the consequences. You'd lose your job, you'd lose your family, you'd become a target. Some newspapers were even tone deaf enough to post the names of survivors who would abruptly have their whole lives blown up. One victim, a teacher, was fired whilst he laid in critical care following the fire after the school learned that he'd been there. He sadly died days later from his injuries. And you can imagine that the result that all of this would have on the investigation following the fire. The police didn't really want to investigate anyway, and that wasn't helped by the fact that the people involved, the people who knew what had happened, were too scared to go to the police and tell their stories because they could be arrested just for being there. By the end of August 1973, the New Orleans PD closed its investigation without ever questioning the very obvious suspect in this case. In the early days of the investigation, they were under the impression that the suspect in question was called Jerry or Johnny, despite Buddy Rasmussen having literally handed them Roger Nunez minutes after the fire. They canvassed the streets looking for this non-existent man and came back, surprise, surprise, empty-handed. But eventually investigators found out the real name of the man they were looking for was Roger Nunez, and they also found out exactly where he lived, where they found him sleeping on the sofa. He was taken to the station for questioning, however on the way he had a seizure and was rushed into hospital to have surgery on a fractured jaw, and the questioning would just never happen. The police would say that over the coming days they'd check in on Nunez, but each time would say that he was unable to speak because of the surgery. Eventually, the hospital released him to the care of his mother despite him being wanted in an active police investigation. And from here, Nunez would evade police detectives for weeks. And another survivor of the fire would bravely come forward to pick out a photo of Nunez from a lineup, saying that he had threatened to burn the bar down. This identification was all the information detectives needed, and at this point they actively stopped pursuing any other leads. But they still couldn't find Nunez, and they didn't even try all that hard. For reasons unknown, on the 30th of August 1973, they closed the case without ever interviewing him. They said that too many witnesses had come forward with conflicting testimony, and they simply filed away the fire as of undetermined origin, and that was that. This is despite them finding the can of lighter fluid in the stairway. It was clearly an arson. Now, this report wouldn't be made public for many years, so at the time there was no public outcry, not really that I think there would have been. However, around this same time, a warrant was issued for the arrest of Nunez for other crimes entirely, for a probation violation. A friend would later tell investigators that Nunez confessed to starting the fire on at least 4 different occasions, but apparently he didn't realise the whole place would go up in flames. I do have to question why else you'd want to start a fire though if that's not your intention. 2 months after the case was closed, Nunez was finally found at his mother's house and a subpoena was issued to have him questioned. This is interesting because he actually wasn't picked up at this point for his parole violation. This was the Deputy State Fire Marshals of New Orleans who had decided to pick up the UpStairs fire case again. So they actually didn't realise there was an active warrant out for his arrest, and had they realised, he should have been arrested on the spot, not just questioned. The fire marshals asked Nunez if he'd be willing to take a polygraph test, to which he did agree, and for that he had to be driven to the New Orleans Police Department headquarters over 100 miles away. Undoubtedly, this would have made him very nervous, the waiting, the sweating, going back to New Orleans where there was an active warrant out for his arrest. He said that his head injury had caused him to forget a lot of the previous months, saying he didn't even remember if he was in the bar the night of the fire. The polygraph test, however, indicated that he was lying in all his answers in regards to the fire, at which point his attorney told him to stop, but he still wasn't arrested. Over the next year, Nunez's mental health would seem to decline rapidly, even having a stay at a mental health institution in Louisiana at one point, and he was also scheduled to have brain surgery. He was also in the middle of a divorce from his wife. On the 15th of November 1974, Roger Nunez took his own life, taking any answers as to the fire with him. His autopsy would reveal a tumour growing in his cerebral cortex. Could that be an explanation as to his very strange behaviour? Could that lead to a lack of impulse control that potentially means that he starts a fire? We don't have an answer to that, but it's a definite possibility. In 1980, the State Fire Marshal's Office, which did more than police investigators ever did, closed the case citing a lack of leads. When presented with the evidence against Roger Nunez, the DA declined to accept the case and gave no reason as to why. Investigators said that they were completely satisfied, and that was that. Nunez has always been the main suspect, but there was never any conviction, so we can't say for sure that it was him. But the evidence isn't looking good for him. On top of all of this, there was also the question of fire safety in the bar as well. Reports surfaced that said the UpStairs bar hadn't been inspected by a city inspector in more than 2 years at the time of the fire due to their staff shortages. Had an inspector turned up, maybe they would have told the owners that the rayon wallpaper in the stairway and in the bar as a whole was incredibly flammable. Maybe they would have said that the back door needed a functioning exit sign, that the bars on the window needed to be removed. But none of that happened. Perhaps you'll say that all the fault of this lies on the owners, but fire safety regulations weren't as strict as they are nowadays. These were all likely things you didn't think about until something like this happened. The lack of fire safety and the lack of any recent inspections is just the cherry on top of a cake in a case like this. For decades, the UpStairs fire was forgotten by everyone except those present and those closest to the deceased. But in the 1990s, there was some renewed interest when a local writer called Johnny Townsend started to interview survivors. At the same time, a local MCC pastor called Dexter Breck started a campaign to place a permanent memorial at the site. It took him many years of campaigning, but in 2003 he finally succeeded when a bronze plaque was put in place. People have been working to educate, working to spread the word of what happened that night, and public observances have been held at the memorial site on the 30th, 40th and 45th anniversaries, which is better late than never, I suppose. I'm sure they will do something next year on the 50th anniversary as well. As I said at the beginning of this video, it was sadly the Pulse nightclub attack that led to people finally talking about what happened at UpStairs. Another tragedy shouldn't have had to have happened for people to make comparisons, but that's sadly what the world is. There's never been any justice here in this case, just pain, but we can try and remember what happened. We can try and educate. I say it all the time, but I truly believe that education is the only thing that can fight hate. Learning about people who live differently to you, learning about different cultures and ways of life. All too often, hate grows from miseducation. We sadly have a really long way to go when it comes to homophobia and transphobia. Some of the news I read in regards to LGBTQ+ rights coming out of the USA even today terrifies me. And I hope that at least one person can watch this video and perhaps think a little bit differently. Think about whether people deserve this kind of treatment because of who they love. The fire wasn't necessarily started because of homophobia, but the response to the disaster was. Had this happened in a straight place, then the police probably would have done a lot more investigating. Roger Nunez would have been arrested and he would have been questioned. There wouldn't have been jokes in the paper, it wouldn't have been minimised in the way it was. It would have been spoken about, it would have been headlines across the country, maybe across the world. The fact that it was ignored, that's heartbreaking. The fact that people were outed, the fact that people lost their jobs because of being in this disaster, the fact that people lost their families, the fact that bodies were just left unclaimed because the families were so ashamed, that is awful and it makes me want to cry even thinking about it. I suppose with that, there's nothing more to say. I'm going to end this video, end this episode. Thank you so much for watching and I will see you in the next one. Bye guys.